We're actually here at the MPS Profit Practice Program. We're on day 3 of the 3-day program, and we've had the great privilege and honor of having Jonathon Blattmachr attend the program with his great team at Interactive Legal. And so one of the things that we have for all of you here in the program is Jonathon's agreed to share his thoughts and insights about the future of the law practice, and he's agreed to do that in 30 minutes, so we can enjoy the rest of our lunch. So it is with great honor, and Jonathon, I thank you for all of your generosity. You're one of the most generous people we've come across, and we look forward to hearing what else you have to offer.
Thank you very much, Dave, and you honor me by allowing me to participate and talk to you about a topic which I really do think is important. In fact, the reason all of you are here is that you obviously care about the future of your legal practice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see the future of the practice to be and what you can do about that. One of the things that makes it difficult, however, to talk about what we're going to do in the future of the practice is trying to forecast change. Change is very difficult to figure out. We all make a lot of mistakes in that. But almost all businesses, whether they're big businesses like General Motors or little businesses, the local construction company, and even nonprofits plan for the future. Because if you don't plan, the chances of your meeting your goals are diminished. And in my experience, most lawyers really don't plan. I mean, they may say, I know I'm going to need money in 2 weeks for the rent or to pay my secretary or something like that. But making the kind of long-range plans that businesses typically do, I've never found law firms doing. But in any event, we've got to kind of forecast the future. And that's very, very tough to do because of how quickly change occurs. For example, 2,000 years ago, the rate of time it took for human knowledge to double was 1,000 years. So if you took a snapshot at the year 1 AD and you saw how changes were occurring, it was going to take 1,000 years at that rate of change for human knowledge to double. By 1900, obviously the world had much more knowledge. The rate of doubling, even though there was much more knowledge that had to be doubled, was at a rate of 100 years instead of 1,000. You know what the rate of change is right now? I think of all we know compared to 1900, but the rate of change now is every 18 months, which means in 36 months, 3 years from now, the world will have 4 times the knowledge that it has today. Now let me go back and just say a couple of things about when I got out of law school in 1970, and I realize there's nobody here quite as old as I am. Mike, what year did you get out of law school?
72.
72, so it wasn't that terribly different. But when Mike and I got out of law school, the state of the art for a lawyer in producing documents, which is typically what you do for clients, was all done by electric typewriter. Now there was a great advance called the IBM Selectric typewriter because that allowed you, if you made a mistake, to actually back up, hit the wrong key again, and hit the right key, and you didn't have to pull a piece of paper out of the typewriter and rip it up or use whiteout or something like that. And I'm going to tell you, this was a remarkable advance. I mean, people were just couldn't believe how phenomenal it was that you could back up, hit the wrong key again, it would disappear miraculously, and then you could hit the right key and go on. Then in 1976, when I was writing my first book on carryover basis, which of course we have a modified system of, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, all of a sudden I saw this remarkable thing called word processing. Now let me tell you how that got going. There was the chairman of Milbank, the fellow who told me that it might even be unethical for lawyers to plan. He in the 1950s had gone to IBM and said, you know how you have these IBM punch cards? Is anybody here old enough to know what an IBM punch card is? Well, back in the old days, when you ran a computer, you had small, they were about 3 by 9 inch thin cardboard cards with one corner cut out so you'd know the proper way to stack them. And that's where the numbers went. And you might have them up to 6 or 8 feet high. And those IBM punch cards would run through the computer, extracting the number information, and then they could use it to manipulate it, multiply, divide, do algorithms or anything else. And Fran went to IBM and said, look, instead of putting numbers on these IBM punch cards. I want you to put words and sentences. And I want you to put in the order that the sentences will make the paragraphs in the document, and then the paragraphs will be arranged so that the document is there. So instead of going to an old document that I worked on before, the one that my mind tells me is closest to what I need right now, and then making a photocopy of it and then marking it up by hand and giving it to my secretary who's going to type it all from anew, even if I'm only changing the middle part of it or the end part or whatever, it has to be completely retyped. I want you to just let me change the cards that need to be changed. I can take out 100 or 10 or 80 IBM punch cards, put in the new sentences, and I'll have a new document. And they said, Mr. Musselman, you're joking, of course. No one would ever want anything like that, and we will not do it. Well, Fran went back in the mid-1960s and asked again, and they said, okay, Mr. Musselman, we'll do it. We're going to charge you full boat. We're not going to give you any discount. And oh, by the way, sign this document which says, if there is any commercial viability to this, and we're confident it isn't, we own it and you don't. Fran told me signing that document was the biggest financial mistake he had ever made in his life. And that is how the concept of word processing was developed. And it is extraordinary. And in fact, when I got to a Milbank in 1977, and it had one of the first systems, an entire floor was devoted to word processing, and Milbank had more technology people than the city of New York combined. It was extraordinary. And almost every day, lawyers and even businesses from around the entire world would come to Milbank and see the system that Fran had built. The big change, however, even more than that, of what we use today was something called WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, which meant you could see it on a computer screen, and that is exactly how it would come out on the paper. And you could actually see it, you could read it, you could go back and make changes, and this was just an extraordinary event. And I remember reading about it in the late 1970s. There was a big article in the New York Times about how it was so extraordinary. And can you imagine trying to practice today without word processing? You wouldn't be in business. By the way, it took over a dozen years for lawyers really to adopt word processing as the way in which things would be done in law firms, the documents that would be produced. And again, today you wouldn't have it at all. If you wanted to have anything in writing delivered or sent, there was one way. The United States Postal Service, that's the way it was. And you'd send a letter, and then maybe 4 or 5 days later you would get another letter back, and then you would send your letter. And of course, nobody could have foreseen the kind of changes we have today with things like email. Legal research, when I got out of law school, when Mike got out of law school, somebody says go research an issue, you went to books. And typically you'd go to a book and you'd look up in the index using some sort of legal principle like contract and oral contract with a minor or whatever it is. And you'd go down and then you'd start reading the book, hoping you'd find something that related to your issue. And then you'd find a case and you'd go read that case, and it didn't answer the question, but maybe there were other cases cited in there, and then you'd look at those. And sometimes you'd go to something called the Centennial Digest, which were great, big, thick books where West broke things down again by legal topic. In 1972, when I got back out of the Army, I was the 7th person in the United States to learn Lexis, and it was extraordinary. And again, can you imagine today having to go back only to books as a way to research? And the kind of thing I want to tell you is you cannot afford to get behind the change curve. If you do get behind the change curve, it would be like trying to practice law today without at least word processing, if not without this next generation called document assembly, which is the system that Dave is offering you. It's the one that the company that Mike and I write the computer program for and Trish is the president of. It's a document assembly system. And document assembly is to word processing what word processing is to the electric typewriter. And you've got to get with it, because if you get too far behind the curve, you're not going to be able to compete.